Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Meet the Expert event with Sean Connaughton from Auditel, a leading cost, procurement and carbon solutions company. Sean will take questions at the end, although I think Sean will be quite happy to take any questions as we go along as well. So without further ado, over to Sean.
Thanks, Rosalind. I think what we'll do, because there's not a lot of us on the webinar, basically, let's treat it as if we were in a room. So we'll try and make it kind of conversational as we go. So if you do have any questions, either just raise your hand or shout out, and if I can answer them, I will. If I can't, I may come back to you and refer to one of my colleagues. But today we're looking at, carbon accounting reporting. If I say to people, net zero, carbon neutrality, decarbonisation, sustainability. There's a lot of confusion around about these subjects. And what we want to try and do today is trying to kind of demystify a lot of that. We're also looking at, kind of a 101 in carbon. What is carbon? Why does it matter? What impact's it got in our business? We'll look at, the standards that we could be working to when we're doing carbon accounting. We'll also look at the benefits to organisations. And the benefits are not purely, environmental or ethical, but they can be financially benefits. Auditel, we firmly believe that reducing your carbon reduces your costs at the same time. For most organisations, we're trying to kind of demystify this myth that carbon reporting, carbon accounting is just another unwanted cost for businesses, whereas it can make you more profitable if it's done properly. We'll look at understanding scope 1, 2 and 3 and a bit about reporting on your carbon emissions. And what data you need to look at collecting and how do you collect it. So that's kind of background of what we're actually looking to do today. But before we start, I want to kind of just put in some kind of context. Has anybody heard of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? You can answer it? Yeah. So basically, when it comes to sustainability, the UN, around about 2014, set out 17 goals that they believed needed to be achieved to, for the planet and for the economy to remain sustainable. So when we actually talk about sustainability, you are looking at a number, a wide, diverse set of subject matters. However, for today, our focus in this session is on climate action. It's about decarbonisation. But when you're putting together a sustainability plan or a sustainability policy for your organisation, be aware of the rest of them. Not every one of them will be relevant to you. A lot of them were set up and actually, focused on governments, NGOs, corporates, but be aware of them. And if you can do something about it, build it into your policy. But as I say, for today, we're going to focus on climate action, which is number 13 of the SDGs. So, to give you some impact, on where carbon is, if I asked you, how long do you think we've actually known about the impact that carbon's having on the planet? Would any of you have said 200 years? You'd have probably thought
only after reading your slide, yeah.
You'd have probably thought 30, 40 years maximum. And most people believe that we started hearing about, the whole ozone layer in the mid-90s. We then started, Al Gore had his video came out the early 2000s, and probably after Kyoto, Paris and Glasgow and the COP, that's when more and more businesses actually started taking notice. However, as you see here, it's exactly 200 years ago since scientists actually discovered, that carbon has an impact on the climate, and its role is, where it sits. Now, when we hear about the greenhouse effect, what that is that the reason there's life on Earth is that we have a layer around the Earth that actually allows a certain amount of heat and radiation from the sun in and deflects the rest into space. Just similar to a greenhouse will keep that temperature at a certain temperature, not let it get too hot or too cold. And that is why we have got, life on this Earth. But what has been discovered, in 1859, Eunice Foote suggested that CO2 was the main greenhouse gas. So that's 170 years ago we were actually identifying these things. And as recently as 1938, Guy Callender demonstrated that the rise in CO2 levels had increased and that the world and the planet had warned as a consequence of that. So we've known about it for a long, long time, but we haven't done much about it. And what we've got here is showing, when we hear about global warming, and a lot of people say, yeah, we get global warming, but you're outside and it's still cold in winter and different things like that. But what scientists have actually discovered as well is that the amount of particles of carbon in the atmosphere correlate to exactly what's happening here. And what you see is that when it drops down here, now carbon parts usually go from about 175 to 300 parts per million. And that's going back nearly 1 million years, in carbon dating they've done here. And what you get is when it drops to around about 175, we get an ice age. And when it goes up to about 300, that's the greenhouse effect. And usually it won't allow it to go much further than that. And when people say, yeah, but we shouldn't be doing anything because the climate is cyclical, it is cyclical. And it has been cyclical for hundreds of thousands, millions of years. But then if you look at 1800 to 1900, and we see that spike, that all of a sudden, the carbon has went from between 175 to 300 to over 400 parts. What do you think happened then?
Industrial revolution.
Correct. We started burning fossil fuels. Man started burning fossil fuels, and what we've had is this is where the global warming is coming from. Now, what that has led to is since the 1880s right up until now, the actual average temperature of the Earth has risen by 1.1 degrees. Now, a lot of people might think 1.1 degrees, that's not a lot. And that's where the confusion between climate and weather and temperature comes in. Now, we're not talking about, outside today it'll be -4 or 5 potentially, and that could rise down south to maybe 6 or 7. That's a big variance in temperature. But we're talking about the actual temperature of the Earth. Now, if you think of your body, our body temperature is approximately 37. It doesn't matter what the temperature of the air is outside is, our body temperature remains around about 37. But what happens if our body temperature rises 2 or 3 degrees to 39, 40? We've got a fever. We're ill. Just for that 2, 3 degrees rise in body temperature. And it's the same with the Earth. That 1.1 might not seem a lot, but it can be catastrophic if it continues to rise. Now, the way, in 2014 at the Paris COP, scientists actually said that to avoid catastrophe, we had to keep that rise in temperature to below 2, ideally 1.5 degrees. However, the forecasts were that if we actually continued business as normal, we would see a rise by the end of this century by potentially 3 and 4 degrees. And that would be catastrophic. We would be talking about severe droughts, severe heat. We're looking at mass migration of people as parts of the world became uninhabitable. So if you see what we've seen in the past, even this year, 2022, we saw massive heat rises in Europe. London get its highest temperature. We were looking at droughts in Spain. There was no tomatoes getting produced. There was no lettuces getting produced. And that's still when we're around about 1.1 degrees. Can you imagine the impact if it does rise to 1.5, 2, 3, 4 degrees? It's going to have a massive impact on, us. And I think one of the things that we try and get across, me personally, is we need to get away from this, we're saving the planet. This isn't about saving the planet. What's it about? It's about saving mankind. The planet will still be here. The planet will be here in 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years, 1,000,000,000 years. The planet will still be here. What will happen is that if we destroy the planet as we know it, it will go through a next evolutionary phase. And an equilibrium will be met. And maybe in 10,000 years, the planet will come back down to what it should be. And it will then go back to that cyclical climate. This is about saving man. And I think people are quite selfish by nature. And if we think, I don't want to save the planet, what's the planet do for me? Whereas if you start to talk about, this is about saving yourself, your kids, your grandchildren, people might start to take notice. So that's kind of a quick background on carbon. But when we talk about carbon, we're actually not just talking about carbon dioxide. When we talk about carbon reporting, we're talking about all greenhouse gas emissions. Now, those kind of clever scientists I mentioned earlier, they identified, there used to be 6, there is now 7 greenhouse gases that are having the worst impact on the environment. And carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, these are all greenhouse gases. But what they decided was that rather than asking companies to report individually on their output emissions for each individual gas, which would probably be too complex and would put a lot of people off, we talk about carbon footprints, carbon planning, carbon reduction, but we're actually talking about all gases are included in that. It's not just about carbon. And each of those gases, they have what's called a global warming power. Now, CO2, and the reason we talk about carbon is it's the most abundant of the greenhouse gases, but it's also the least potent. So each of the other gases has that global warming power, which is a multiple of. So if you take methane, 1 ton of methane is the equivalent of 25 tons of carbon and the impact it can have on the environment. 1 ton of nitrous oxide is the equivalent of 298 tons of carbon dioxide in the environment. So when we are doing your carbon footprint and we're looking at carbon reporting, we're including all the greenhouse gases. But what we do in that figure you see here on the screen, TCO2E, does anybody know what that stands for? It's tons of CO2 equivalent. So you'll start to see that more and more, in that what we're doing is you're converting each of the gases into the equivalent of CO2. So if you emit 1 ton of methane, or sorry, 25 tons of methane, that is converted back to what it would be in carbon. So in other words, it's 25 times as potent. Nitrous oxide, if you emit 1 ton of nitrous oxide, that is equivalent of 298 tons of carbon. So that's that TCO2E. So when you see a carbon footprint from a company, it won't just talk about carbon, it'll be TCO2E. And it's basically what they've done is they've taken all their greenhouse gases, they've calculated their emissions, and they've converted it back. And it's to make it easier to report on, so that you're not actually individually reporting each one. You're reporting on them all, but you're then converting it back to carbon. And it's the same when we talk about decarbonisation or carbon strategies. It's not just about carbon, it's how do we remove as many of these greenhouse gases from the atmosphere as possible, because they're all doing damage. When you look at some of them, some of the NF3s, 16,000 times as potent as 1 ton of CO2. Now, a lot of these are refrigeration gases. There's not a lot of them, but a small leak can have a massive impact on the environment. And that's why, you know, more and more organizations, more and more businesses are looking at how do we replace these gases with something that's safer. So a wee bit of a kind of quiz. We'll have all heard of certain terminology. What does carbon neutrality mean? Anybody hazard a guess?
Status quo.
Yep.
Yeah. Dermot.
Yeah, okay. It's emitting no more carbon into the atmosphere than one is removing.
Close. Anybody else?
Is it just a static point? No,
Not
it's
so-
just
not
a-
so much a static point. Carbon neutrality allows for offsetting, right? So it's about balancing as apart from the full removal. So if as an organization, you create 100 tons of carbon in your reporting period, you can then purchase 100 tons of offsets. And as long as they're verifiable offsets and they're gold standard, you can take that 100 tons and purchase them, and you have become carbon neutral for that reporting period. So similar to financial reporting periods, your financial year might run from January to December. Your carbon year could run from January to December. And during that reporting period, you could produce 100 tons. You then offset 100 tons. You're carbon neutral for that reporting period. The next day, you're no longer carbon neutral because you're into a new reporting period and you would need to do the same again. So carbon neutrality is about offsetting and balancing it out, what you create by taking it out. Now, offsets, a lot of people believe offsets are mainly around about planting trees, and that is one form of offsetting. But offsets, to be gold standard or verifiable, there needs to be additionality. So in other words, it would not have happened unless you'd invested in it. So you can't just say, oh, we've got trees in the back door and we're keeping those trees. There needs to be common good, and it needs to actually be able to extract that amount of carbon, and that needs to be verified. Now, some offsetting projects could be investing in renewable energies in developing countries. It could be investing in decarbonisation of heat or steam in developing countries. So there's lots of different types of offsets. Yes, peatlands and forestry are one, but it's only one of many. But offsets allows you to actually create your carbon and then offset it. Now, downside to that is that rich companies could continue to offset for the next 50 years and they're not actually having an impact on the environment because they're continuing to create emissions. And also, if I drew a circle on a wall and it was 2 meters wide, and that was the offsets required globally, and you put 5 pence in the middle, that's the offsets available. So offsetting is not the answer. It's a short-term solution, but it's not the answer to our issues. Net zero. We hear that constantly, and we have for the past 3-4 years, net zero, net zero, net zero. Anybody hazard a guess to what net zero actually is?
Yeah,
Emma?
it's what I said, is that you are
You're removing.
you're removing at least as much as you're emitting.
Correct. So basically, net zero is when you start with your 100 tons, but through time, you're actually removing 100 tons by implementing different types of solutions or actions that you take. Now, the reason it's called net zero rather than zero is, again, there is a balancing part here. And the next slide, I'll kind of go into that in more detail and explain it. But the true definition of net zero that has been reached by Science Based Targets Initiative in the UN is that you achieve 10% of your baseline emissions by your target date. So if it's as an organisation, if you set 2050 as your target date for net zero, and your baseline was 100 tons, they want to see you remove 90 tons by switching to renewable energy, by getting rid of fossil fuels, by working with your supply chain to actually make them more efficient. These are the actions that you would do to actually get yourself to that you're only emitting 10 tons by your target date. And the reason it's that 10 tons or that 10% is that the hope by that date, the technology for carbon capture, carbon storage, carbon curing will be affordable and scalable. It's here just now, it's not affordable and it's not scalable, but that will remove that last part. So we will still create some emissions, but the technology will remove that. The residual part will be removed from the atmosphere through technology. And that's what net zero actually means. Carbon zero. Any guesses on that? It means that we don't produce any CO2 at all. And at this moment in time, that's not possible. We will always create emissions going about our day-to-day business. What we need to do is identify the emissions we're creating and how do we eliminate as many of them as possible and moving towards that net zero target. So this slide kind of shows what we mean by net zero. So if you look it up here, if that was your emissions, let's say it was 100 tons, and you're removing only 5 tons or 10 tons, the balance is still towards you're creating emissions. What you want to do is to get to here, where the balance is what you create is then removed. Now, if we look at this graph down here, this is where we're trying to get to over the next 30 years, that we are still producing quite a lot. And at the moment, it's about 55 gigatons of CO2 globally. And what we can actually remove is a tiny, tiny fraction of that. So what we're hoping that businesses, governments, organisations do over the next 30 years is we reduce the amount of emissions that we're actually creating. At the same time, technology starts to remove a higher amount of emissions through carbon capture, carbon storage, whatever, till we get to the stage that there is a balance. So we might be creating the globe might be 1 gigaton, and we're then removing 1 gigaton. We have achieved net zero, and it is that net figure. It's not zero because we'll always be producing it. And for us to get there, for us as a planet to reach the 1.5 degrees, we need to be trying to get it by 2050. Now, the UK government was the first government worldwide to actually set it in law. I think there's approximately, and this changes week to week, there's approximately 130 governments now have set in law net zero targets, anything from about 2045 to 2060. But it's not just governments. Governments can only do so much. Businesses need to take responsibility. Individuals need to take responsibility. This is one thing that we're all in it together. And small steps will help, because this is a journey. You know, this is something that we all need to be planning for the next 25, 30, 40, 50 years. This isn't a project, it's a process that we need to get into the habit of doing. But we actually need to measure our carbon, understand what we're producing as an organisation, and identify what we can do to reduce it going forward. Any questions so far?
Yeah, Sean.
Yeah.
Can I just recap on the net zero target? I'm not sure I got it right. So the aim is by a target date to achieve 90%
reduction
of
your baseline.
of the emissions.
Of the emissions, yes. So, Dermot, if you imagine a business has set a target date of 2050, and currently they do their baseline in 2022. So they're doing their first ever carbon footprint. That's the baseline. And they've identified they are producing 100 tonnes.
Yeah.
For them to really reach net zero, they need to reduce that to 10 tonnes by 2050. And it's what actions they will take in that period is going to determine if they can get to there. Nobody's looking for companies to say, we're at 100 tonnes, we're going to get to zero.
Right. And is that before or after any
no offsetting?
No offsetting. Right.
No
okay.
offsettings at all. Net zero does not allow for offsettings. Net zero is about pure reduction and removal of carbon from the atmosphere. Mike.
Sean, Mike's got a question as well.
Mike.
Sorry, Sean. It was actually to apologise. I need to leave for another meeting, but I've really enjoyed your discussion, Sean, and thank you very much for organising, Rosalind.
No problem.
No problem.
I guess I'll hear the recording. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll share that later today, hopefully.
Okay. Sorry about that. Thanks so much.
Bye, Mike.
Cheers. Bye.
Sean, I've got a question actually. When you're referring there to technology, how does the technology remove the emissions?
So, Kat, don't ask me to go into it because I'm not an engineer or scientist, but you've got things like carbon curing, carbon capture, and carbon storage. So, carbon curing, I think, Kirsty, you're in the construction industry, aren't you?
Yeah.
Right. So, you've heard of carbon curing?
I actually haven't.
Right. So, carbon curing, what they're discovering now is that when we look at concrete is one of the biggest emitters of carbon in emission across the world. Construction's huge. And for years and years and years, it was mainly ready-mix concrete. Mm-hmm. What happens is when you're actually mixing that concrete on site, the emissions are actually emitting into the atmosphere. Whereas what they've discovered by doing precast, they can capture some of that carbon and put it back into the concrete. Mm-hmm. So that's carbon curing. So in other words, they've created it, caught it, and put it back in. And as long as that's in that precast block, it's there for eternity potentially until that block gets broken up. So that's carbon curing.
So is it almost like capturing it?
It's capturing it.
Yeah.
Carbon capture and storage. So if you think, one of the things they're looking at is that see all the oil wells throughout the world that we've extracted that oil and coal, there's space in there. Can we put the carbon back into that? The earth, absorbs carbon. The sea absorbs carbon. So it's about how can we look at taking that carbon that's in the air or any of the greenhouse gases and absorbing it, storing it, curing it. And that will come. And as the graph shows, at the moment, we're doing a tiny amount of that. But through time, we should get to the stage if we can actually capture or store the equivalent amount of what we're actually producing, there's no more new carbon going into the atmosphere. That's when we've achieved net zero. So that's kind of background on carbon. Greenwashing, have we heard of the term greenwashing?
Yeah.
Yep.
So basically, greenwashing is when organisations, mainly businesses, not so much governments and that, but mainly businesses will make claims that cannot be substantiated or would not stand up to scrutiny. And it happens all the time. And it's been happening since companies started to look at carbon. And it's not just small companies. These are all multinational corporates who have been guilty of greenwashing at one time or another. Companies like IKEA, who we believe are sustainable, environmentally friendly, were caught illegal logging in the Balkans. Sorry, the Baltics. You've had, remember McDonald's, when McDonald's released the paper straw? And there was a big, McDonald's are actually a sustainable company. They're moving from plastic straws to paper. This is wonderful. They used to have a plastic straw in a paper sheath. They went to having a paper straw in a plastic sheath. And the inside of the straw had a plastic lining. So a lot of things are not actually thought through. And these are just some of the things that some of them have done, Ryanair, false low emissions. We'll all remember Volkswagen, and they're being getting sued for billions. So basically, greenwashing is when organisations will put out something because it sounds good, they believe the public will buy into it, but it's actually false. Now, in the past, they got away with it, However, from January this year, the Competitions and Marketing Authority in the UK have started to actually prosecute greenwashing under consumer law, which means directors can go to jail for up to 2 years. So you'll see a lot of greenwashing disappear, and you'll see certain things will come off of websites and out of brochures now. So for organisations and for businesses like yourself, if you're going to actually say something publicly, make sure that you can actually, it stands up to scrutiny, because you will be challenged. You will be challenged. So try and avoid greenwashing as much as you can. But how do we measure it? What's the benefits? There's massive benefits for actually starting to do your carbon reporting. It helps you win business. It helps win business. The amount of times we see now in tenders that you're asked, what is your green credentials? What are you doing about carbon reduction? Last year, the government brought out a policy notice, PPN 0621, that all government contracts over £5 million from last September must have a carbon reduction plan attached to the initial tender, or the bid goes no further. You can have the best tender, the best price, the best quality. You don't have a carbon reduction plan, you're kicked out at stage one. Now, a lot of companies might go, but we don't bid for £5 million government contracts. You might not, but you might be part of the supply chain. One of your customers may, and you're part of their footprint. So they'll be coming to you and asking you what you're doing, and it filters down through the supply chain. Now, that £5 million, we believe, will drop to 3 million next year. It'll probably drop to 1 million the year after it. And the forecast is that by 2025, all public contracts, regardless of the value, will need to have a carbon reduction plan attached. Now, when the public sector do something, guess what? The private sector follow on. And what we are starting to see is that template for PPN 0621, a lot of the private sector just adapted that, changed it slightly, and that's what they're now using. So we've had a house builder recently, does a lot of social housing. I've been after them for about 2 years, telling them they need to do something about their carbon, and they said, yeah, we'll get round to it, we'll get round to it, we'll get round to it. 1st of October, they're on the phone to me, panicking like hell. £15 million tender, they've seen this document, what do we do about it? I said, well, you can't bid for it. That's £15 million worth of work. Are you going to have a carbon reduction plan by the 28th of October? Nope. I've been telling you for 2 years. What can we do? I said, I can give you a letter of comfort saying we'll work towards it, Because the good thing is, at this moment in time, a lot of your competitors don't have it either. So although the government have put it out there, it's a kind of scare tactic at the moment to get people to start doing it. So it's going to help you. We see it within the food and drink industry. All the major supermarkets have went to every single supplier they've had. They've set out the expectations. This is what we expect from our supply chain by 2023, 24, 25, 26, 27. Now, none of them are saying, yeah, we will delist you, but that will come. If you get to the stage that you're not going to comply with your customers, they will delist you. They will find another supplier. Other benefits, staff. It helps with staff recruitment and retention, and that's one of the hardest things that most businesses are seeing at the moment in time, getting good staff. Now, particularly younger generation, they're heavily invested in this, and we're starting to see people interview the potential employer by asking questions. What are you doing about carbon? What's your green credentials? Do I want to work for a company that's not doing anything about it? This year, Shell and BP saw their lowest intakes of graduates ever. People are voting with their feet. They don't want to work with a company that's actually polluting the planet. So it will help with staff. Regulation. There's a number of regulations at the moment. ESOS, which is the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. SECAR is Streamlined Energy Carbon Reporting. These are reports that businesses of a certain size need to actually report on. ESOS is every 4 years, SECAR's annually, that goes into your accounts. It's not actually within your audited accounts, it sits within the director's report. But when you start to see the government asking for companies to report on their carbon within their accounts, we know what's coming. Carbon taxes. We don't know when, but it will come. And it's not so much a tax as a penalty, because the higher your carbon output is, the higher money you're going to pay. And then your suppliers. Actually, the amount of collaboration and innovation we start to see nowadays with companies, because your suppliers are part of your footprint and your customers are part of your customers' footprint. So we need to be talking to each other and sharing ideas. This isn't something that if somebody in an industry comes up with a great idea, they keep it to themselves. They share it with everybody. Here's something that we've done. It's going to reduce our footprint. It can reduce yours as well. So that's the benefits. Let's say more than just being ethical and environmentally, it'll help you actually become more profitable. Standards. There's a lot of, standards out there, and a lot of companies have created their own standards around about this because there has been no standardization until recently. And we see a lot of footprint reports done to a standard, and you think it's not worth the paper it's written on, but because they got a nice wee footprint or a picture of the globe in their footprint, they think they've done well. Standards that any organisation should look towards is PAS 2060, which is a BSI standard for carbon neutrality. It's currently the only internationally recognised standard for carbon neutrality. All your reporting should be done to either GHG protocol standards or BSI ISO 14064-1 standards. Now, how BSI and ISOs work is that most countries in the world have their own standards organisation. Standard organisations actually then start to create standards because industry asks for it. They then feed up into ISO, which is based in Switzerland, and everybody understands what an ISO is. It's an internationally recognised standard, whether it's on health and safety, whether it's in carbon, whether it's in management systems, whether it's in energy. We understand these. Now, PAS 2060, now passes are less well recognised, they're publicly available specifications. PAS 2060 is currently in consultation at ISO, and it could become ISO 14068. When that becomes 14068, you'll see a bigger uptake. People understand ISO, they don't understand PAS. So if you're doing anything, every footprint we do, every reduction plan we do for our clients is aligned to PAS 2060 and would meet 14064. Whether or not they wish to go all the way through to full accreditation or verification, it's still done to that standard. So it means that you can never be accused of greenwash. So to give you an idea, let's say PAS 2060, specification for a demonstration of carbon neutrality. 14064 is a guidance on how to actually quantify and report your emissions, as is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Has anybody heard of SBTI, Science Based Targets Initiative?
Yeah.
You have, Kirsty. Science-Based Target Initiative, not government organisation, created around about 2014 by the UN Carbon Disclosure Project. At the start, what they were trying was fantastic. They said everybody needs to set science-based targets to achieve 1.5 degrees. And we're behind that 100%. However, we need to try and separate science-based targets from Science-Based Targets Initiative, because they have now become a commercial organisation, because they've seen that there's money to be made in this. So to sign up to the SBTI, which a lot of corporates are doing, you create your plan, you submit it, they validate it, but they don't really check it, but they say it's validated, and they'll charge you 10 grand for doing so. And it gets you into a nice club that says, we're members of SBTI, and we've actually had our footprint validated. They are doing one for SMEs, and I believe it's going to be between 1,000 and 3,000 to be validated. You don't need to actually join SBTI. You can take that information and you can log it in a government website in the UK, Climate Action, free of charge. And you're actually doing the exact same thing by saying, we've set our science-based targets and here they are, publicly available. It's not going to cost you 10 grand to do so. But every company should be setting science-based targets. Your science-based targets is how we're actually going to achieve it. But they're not mutually exclusive. And the way we try to explain it to clients is net zero is our destination. That's where we're all going to. Science-Based Targets Initiative or Science-Based Targets is our roadmap to get there. Past 2060 is one of the vehicles that we can take to get along that road. And the other two, 14,064 and GHG, is the fuel that fuels the vehicle. So let's say they're not mutually exclusive. It's about ensuring that you set the standards that you're going to work to for the next 20, 30, 40 years. But the ultimate goal for everybody should be net zero. And past 2060, we've pinned a flag to this purely because at the moment it is the only internationally recognised standard for carbon neutrality and ISO 14064, because a company can get their footprint and their reduction plan accredited to that standard, which means if you go out to tender or you're talking to your customers and say, we've got a footprint, it's 14,064 accredited, it's not going to get challenged. It's been third-party verified by a UCAS registered organisation. So footprint and process. And we say it's a process because I said to you earlier, this isn't a project. This is something we just need to get used to doing. You're doing it the same way that you're putting in your financial accounts on an annual basis. Get used to putting in your carbon account on an annual basis. The first thing we need to do is set the goal. What is it we want from a carbon footprint? And a lot of companies, they've got different reasons. Some companies it is because they think it's the right thing to do. Others because they believe it's going to win them business. Others it's because they're now actually feeling they're getting forced to do it by their customers. But understand, what do you want to achieve and why do you want to achieve it? Once you've done that, the next thing is identifying which parts of the business need to be included. Now, at the start for bigger businesses, it might not be including absolutely every single department, every single branch. You might start by saying we're looking at our operational part, and then we're going to move out as we get used to doing this. We can build up from it. And then identify which activities in your business release the greenhouse gas emissions. Now, have we all heard of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have, Kirsty?
No.
No. So what it was, Dermot, was, again, these clever scientists we keep referring back to, and they decided that looking at all 7 greenhouse gases individually was too complicated. So we'll talk about carbon. They also decided that when they looked at where emissions are created, it was complicated. So what they did was they put them into buckets or scopes. So scope 1 is the direct emissions that a business or an organisation actually creates, and that's through your controlled and owned sources. So it's your company facilities, your company vehicles. You've got control of that. You're burning those fuels at the point. Scope 2 is your indirect emissions for energy. Now, it says there electricity, steam, heating and cooling. UK, 99.9% of that is electricity. Other countries import steam and cooling depending on what their processes are. So that is energy that has been burned somewhere else and you're bringing it in. So it's your electricity. And scope 3 is absolutely everything else, upstream, downstream, your value chain and your supply chain. And they broke that into 15 different categories. So when we do a footprint report, we'll look at a company, we'll say, right, we're going to do scope 1, 2, and everything that's relevant within scope 3. Some companies cherry pick and they'll say, we'll do scope 1 and 2 because it's easy, and we'll pick business travel because it's easy, but everything else we're going to ignore.
Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense because there's so much of, most organizations, the biggest part of the emissions will come from scope 3. It'll be their emissions from their supply chain and value chain. So what you should actually do is understand, let's start with an attitude of we're going to include everything. Then we'll exclude what's not relevant to us, because some of those won't be relevant. So franchises, you might know of franchises. Investments, not about where you have your money in your bank. It's if you're making major investments, that's mainly aimed at, venture funds and capitalists. You might not have leased assets. If you're a professional services company like Roslyn, you don't have end-of-life products. You're not producing something. So there will be a lot that are not relevant to you that can be excluded. But the ones that you should be reporting on, you should make every effort to get as much data as possible and report on them.
Sean, can I pause? Oh, unless you're back, let me put my question, and maybe you're coming to the answer. I see this as crucially important. These scopes 1, 2, and 3. So to understand it, let's take an example. Let us say I was a local authority, or I was building houses. I wanted houses built. So I get a builder who's going to build it. And you mentioned concrete. So that builder might either bring in ready mixed concrete, or might themselves precast it, and therefore they're capturing some of the concrete. Or they might outsource and get a supplier to provide the precast concrete. So that would all be
so part of your scope.
It'd be scope 2, would it?
No,
or scope 1?
Scope 3, because
scope 3, right?
They're part of your suppliers. But
right, okay.
The example you've given, there's a standard called PAS 2080, which is specific for the construction industry.
Yeah.
PAS 2080, we're working with one of the major highways companies at the moment to initiate PAS 2080 for them. PAS 2080 takes everything back a step, that before you even get to design, you're getting everything in the same room, and they're looking at how we design buildings, how we design infrastructure, can it be reused, do we need to build it in the first place type thing.
Right.
And actually looking at what is the most efficient and carbon friendly way to actually do this project. And it's been proven, Skanska were one of the first companies behind it. It's been proven if you actually get through the process of PAS 2080, construction companies not only reduce the carbon, and sometimes by up to 50% in the project, they can reduce the actual cost of the project. Sometimes it's as high as 6% by looking at it right for the start. But
can I probe a little bit deeper into this? So let's say I was a construction company, which I think Kirsty is involved with. If and I'm buying in concrete, and if it's coming from a supplier, that would be scope 3. Yeah. But how far back do we go? Now, I'm not very good at the industry and the chemistry of concrete making, but it's energy intensive to take the ingredients and max them. Yeah. But then what about going back to the supply chain, to transport, to get those materials together?
So for each,
what about going back to the factory?
Right. For each
sorry, carry on.
Right. For each organization, your footprint is your operational or financial control.
Right.
So you go to your supplier. So if you're buying products from the supplier, your footprint starts from when you take ownership of that product.
Right.
Transportation, the process, and everything until you.
Okay. Yeah.
Anything that happened before that is your supplier's responsibility. And
that's scope 3.
Yes. And he would go back to his supply chain to find out. So it is, and that's why it goes all the way down and all the way up.
Right. So
But
if one's
boundaries-
pursuing scope
Yeah.
3, how far back do you go?
You only go back to your supplier, your own supplier.
So if supplier has outsourced it, it doesn't count.
No, you find out from him, from when you took ownership, you measure the operational emissions with that product or service. It's his responsibility to do his part before it, and their responsibility before that, all the way back probably to the mining.
Oh,
Right?
it does go back to the
Oh,
mining.
Yeah, but
Right.
not for each business. Each business's boundary is only where they take responsibility.
But do I understand is all for each step in the supply chain is all brought within scope 3?
Correct. Yeah.
Right. So you go back to the mining and
If you
you include the mining equipment?
No, if you take it, and it might be better taking this offline.
Right.
If I buy, say I go to Juicens and buy Gyprock.
Yeah.
My responsibility starts when I purchase that Gyprock from Juicens.
Yeah.
How that Gyprock was produced is not my responsibility.
Quite. Yeah.
It's the responsibility of the manufacturer and Juicens for purchasing it.
Yeah.
So it's steps, because if I was responsible for absolutely everything all the way back, what we end up doing is double counting.
Oh,
Mhm.
enormously so. Yes.
Yeah. So what we try and do is it's about setting the boundaries. In any footprint, the first thing you do is you set the boundaries that you're working to. You record that, and you say this is what we're recording, and what our operational responsibility is. So
Now, this is incredibly important because scope 1 emissions can be reduced by outsourcing an awful lot.
and scope 1 can be reduced by taking control.
Oh, of course. No, I buy that. Yeah.
You switch from, easiest way to think it, see if we all manage and reduce our scope 2 and scope 1, the problem goes away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because our scope 1 and 2 is somebody else's scope 3. And if
Yeah.
we all manage our scope 1 and 2, the whole problem goes away. But we're not that yet.
Except for stuff that's outsourced to the third world where they're not, they can't follow reach such high standards.
No,
No,
well,
I buy your argument, Sean. I'm just being a little bit cynical as about scope 3, what it actually means.
Scope 3 is everything that you're responsible. So if you take business travel, every business trip, if you take Rosalind's business, every time they go out to visit a client, that creates a footprint.
Yeah.
Right. If they go to an exhibition, that creates a footprint. That's all within their scope 3. They should measure that in scope 3. Can they control it? Yes, they can. They can decide which travel. They might decide that they're going to switch to Zoom meetings or Teams meetings. They might say, we're not going to send 6 people to this exhibition. We're going to send 1 person to the exhibition. So you can control these kind of things. Waste. You can actually, we do a lot of waste operations. A company might say price is first and foremost. We're not interested in what happens to it afterwards. However, if you're getting pressure from your customers to say, we want to know what is your landfill avoidance, or we're not going to deal with you, you then take steps to say to your waste management company, what are you doing with the waste once you collect it? And if they say 97% avoids landfill because we reuse it, we recycle it, you're going to say that's good. Our emissions have dropped dramatically because the emissions created from waste is not the same as it all going to landfill. So
Okay.
first part, we can control. Scope 3, we've got less control, but we control, or we can make decisions based on that. If you take upstream distribution, for most organizations, huge, right? DPD are verified carbon neutral to pass 2060 standards. They paid £15 million last year for offsets. If I use DPD as my courier, I have got no emissions in my downstream distribution because they've been taken care of. That then becomes a financial choice I take as a business. I may say, FedEx are, going to give me this for X, but if I go with DPD, my carbon's 0. And that's why it's going to become, for businesses, it will become a competitive advantage if you actually can reduce your carbon further, because you are more attractive to your customers, because you are part of their footprint. So the more you can do, the more it helps them. So one of the first things that you should always do is set the boundaries, as I've been saying. And how we do it is you actually do a full scoping exercise from your business. Where's your premises? Sorry. Where's your premises? What are we using within those? Where's the suppliers? What are we purchasing? How does it get here? It goes to the factory. What happens afterwards? It then goes on to commercial clients. That allows you to then understand, where are we creating emissions? Once you understand where you're creating emissions, the next part is data collection. Because once you know what you're doing, it's then what data do we require? So for any footprint, there's 5 pillars that the GHG set, and it's very similar to financial accounting. It's relevance, completeness, consistency, transparency, and accuracy. So you then go about collecting that data. Now, the data will be internal and external. So you will have some that you can go from your HR department, your finance department, and be able to get. You may have to go to your providers, your suppliers, to get further data. But once you've got the data, it's then about building your carbon inventory. As we see here, for this organisation, this is a real organisation. The buildings, the gas for heating and then fleet, those go into scope 1. So you're looking at the units used, how much units they used, the conversion factor for the year. That gives them a total CO2 kilograms converted into tonnes. So for scope 1, they had just under 20 tonnes in gas and 10 tonnes in diesel. Scope 2, they've got their electricity. You've then got your purchased goods and services. And you're building that picture up to eventually, for each of your scopes and each of your categories, what is your output in emissions? So for this company, you then start to see that they created 433 tonnes, 7% sat within scope 1, 2% sat within scope 2, and 91% sat within scope 3. Now, that is not unusual. Most organisations, the biggest part comes in a scope 3. So that's you'll get your carbon inventory. Once you've done that, that's your carbon footprint report created. Next part, you identify the hotspots, and that's usually a strategy session. So you're saying, right, okay, what can we do to reduce our carbon? We know where we're creating it. And they usually fall within 3 parts: behavioural change, capital investment, or procurement. And procurement could be, if you were spending 200 grand a year in electricity and you were purchasing it from SSE, and that was being produced by gas and coal and nuclear, you might decide to switch to 100% renewable energy company. It may cost you a wee bit more, it may not nowadays. However, your carbon, once you get what's called a REGAL, which is a renewable energy certification, your carbon output is 0, because it's 100% renewable energy you're working. It may be you're switching to electric vehicles, 0 landfill. So these are procurement decisions that company can make. Other ones could be, we're going to invest, we're going to put in LEDs, we're going to put in a buildings management system, we're going to put solar on our roof. These are all kind of capital investment that will reduce your consumption, reduce your costs, and reduce your carbon. And other parts are behavioural. We're going to instigate a car sharing scheme or flexi working, whatever it's going to be. Once you do that, this is you starting your carbon reduction plan by saying, well, we're at 100, how do we get to 10? These are the things that's going to get us to 10. And your plan starts to look something like this. So by 2021, that was a baseline. By 2025, some of the decisions we're going to make should see us drop to here. By 2030, we're going to get here. And again, this is real. So this company, there in 2024, their energy's up for renewal. They're going to switch to 100% renewable energy. They're going to then start switching their fleet from diesel to electric as the new leases come up. So by 2030, scope 1 is going to be 0, scope 2 is going to be 0. They're still going to get 315 tonnes in scope 3, but they'll work with a supply chain to eventually try and get that down to 40. So once you've got your reduction plan, and these are some of the areas that are saying, you know, that this shouldn't be about costing you money. These are all projects we have completed recently for clients, and it shows you that this can be cost effective. So this is a company, we've put in 5 solar arrays in 5 buildings. It wasn't a big project, 67 kilowatt peak. The cost was £59,000. The payback was 3 years and 9 months. Finance director would say that is a no-brainer. They also reduced their carbon by 28%. This is a larger project, computer company, 410 kilowatt peak, 350,000 payback, 3 years, 6 months. I've just did a proposal yesterday for a construction company, industrial company down in Annan. Payback, 2 years, 2 months for solar. Waste. This is a company they had no waste policy when we engaged with them. We introduced new waste policy. We went to tender. We actually looked at who were actually going to, provide the waste management, and one of the bases was on carbon. So what they managed to do was they now have 10% of their waste goes to waste to energy, 87% is recycled. They've got 97% landfill avoidance, but they also reduced their cost by 44%. It pays for itself. LED, that company, that's the same company, they took some of the savings and within their office, they put in LEDs, 3-year payback, reduce their carbon, reduce their cost, another 16 tonnes taken off their footprint. There's a larger warehouse we've just done. Again, capital cost 53,000, return investment 2.1 years, 48 tonnes of carbon removed for their carbon footprint. Company went to EV first. So they've got 200 vehicles, this company. Not only reducing their carbon, there was massive savings by switching to electric vehicles because the whole of life cost is cheaper than a fossil fuel car. Each of the staff sees more money in their pocket because the benefit in kind is lower. So they're getting a pay rise. But again, they're removing nearly 220 tonnes of carbon off their footprint. Energy management system, wholesale in Glasgow. They've got big gas blowers to keep the place warm, not very efficient. They've got doors that open and close all the time. Brand new energy management system for the 3 sites. Capital cost 63,000, 15-month payback, but also reduced 320 tonnes of carbon. Same company, we've just did a forklift truck review. So we're moving from propane to lithium ion. They've upgraded their fleet, so it's brand new equipment as opposed to old inefficient equipment. They're saving £30,000, £38,000 a month and taking 116 tonnes. So you can see that by reducing their carbon, they're also putting more money onto the bottom line. So that is our presentation for today. Hopefully you all get something out of it. I say it is a very confusing arena at the moment because there's a lot of people are just, oh, should we do it? Where do we start? When do we start? How do we do it? Take that first step. Talk to somebody. Once you understand what you can do, the boundaries you're going to set, what you're trying to achieve, you'll then start to see that you understand carbon. You can do something about your carbon. You'll set your carbon reduction targets, but you also see more money in your bottom line. This should be profitable for most people.
They were some amazing examples, Sean, so thanks for sharing them as well. Any more questions for Sean?
Oh, that's fantastic. Thanks very much, Sean.
No problem.
Can I get a copy of the slides? Because there's lots of good stuff, like the standards I couldn't note down. Yeah.
What I'll do is I'll send the slides to Rosalind, and I believe she's going to send the slides and the recording out to everybody that registered as well. Because I know there was about 12 people that, just couldn't make it, so again, the slides are there. My contact details are there. If anyone wants to get in touch with us to have a chat, more than happy. One of the things we're doing for a lot of companies just now is we're doing kind of energy reduction clinics. So basically free of charge, we'll look at your energy consumption. What we'll do is we'll come up with 3 or 4 solutions to say, look, if you implement that, there's a cost savings, there's a benefit, and that's what it's going to do. And let's say some of the paybacks, we've just done one this week for a large distribution company on the refrigeration. Now they are paying, and I don't know what you're paying, Kirsty, at the moment, but they're paying 10 pence a kilowatt hour still for electricity. I know it's amazing, right? And they're there till 2024. Their payback is 12 months. If they were paying 36 pence, which is kind of average at the moment, their payback would have been 3 months in the project.
Wow.
They will save that money for the next 25 years.
Wow.
Amazing.
So, because of the high energy prices, the payback in a lot of these solutions is just dropped dramatically. Now's the time to be doing it, because let's face it, we're not going to get cheaper electricity or gas. That's not going to happen. So the only way you can reduce it is reduce your consumption. But happy to talk to anybody, but I say I'll get the slides over to Rosalind, and I'm sure she'll get them out to you all in the next couple of days.
Yeah, there was even people who weren't registered that were wanting a copy of the video as well, because they just knew they couldn't make it. So that way I'll share it with the client base as well. And as you say, your client, your contact details on it, but I'll also put them in the email, send it out so everyone can pick those up.
Well, thanks.
Yeah,
for your
massive thank you to Sean for this morning's session, and thanks to those who joined. And of course, we'll be in touch in the new year with future events and roll out that events diary again. So, yeah, thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Good.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thanks
Bye.
very much. Bye.
Bye.